The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty plains of Arizona Territory as Thomas Mitchell rode his weary horse along the winding creek bed. His weathered hands gripped the reins tightly, knuckles white with desperation that had consumed him for 3 endless days. Behind him, tied to his saddle, hung an empty milk pail that mocked his failure with every metallic clang against the leather. Thomas was a man carved from the harsh frontier itself. His face bore the deep lines of someone who had wrestled with drought, disease, and the countless challenges that came with running a cattle ranch in the unforgiving Southwest. His clothes were dust-covered and sweat-stained, evidence of sleepless nights spent searching for something that seemed impossible to find. Back at his ranch house, a desperate situation grew worse by the hour. His wife Sarah had given birth to their son just 4 days ago, but complications during the difficult delivery had left her weak and unable to produce milk for the hungry infant. The nearest town with a doctor or wet nurse was 3 days' hard ride away, and little baby William was growing weaker with each passing hour. Thomas had tried everything he could think of. He had attempted to feed the baby water mixed with honey, but the child rejected it. He had ridden to his nearest neighbor's ranch, old Pete Harrison, hoping to find a milk cow, but a recent bout of disease had claimed Pete's entire herd. The other ranches were too far away, and time was running out. The sound of his baby's weak cries echoed in Thomas's memory as he pushed his horse forward. He had been a soldier in the war, had faced down rustlers and wild animals, but nothing had prepared him for the helpless feeling of watching his own child waste away from hunger. Sarah lay in their bed, pale and exhausted, tears streaming down her face as she held their son close, unable to provide what he needed most. As Thomas rode deeper into the canyon country, he found himself in territory he rarely visited. This was Apache land. And while there had been an uneasy peace in recent months, most white settlers still avoided these remote areas. But desperation had driven him beyond the boundaries of caution. He would search every creek, every hidden valley, every possible place where he might find a cow or goat that could save his son's life. The landscape around him was breathtaking in its stark beauty. Red sandstone cliffs rose like cathedral walls on either side of the narrow valley, and ancient petroglyphs told stories of peoples who had lived here long before any white man had set foot on this land. Despite his urgent mission, Thomas couldn't help but feel small and insignificant in this vast wilderness. His horse suddenly stopped and pricked its ears forward. Thomas strained to listen and heard something that made his heart race with hope: the distant lowing of cattle. Following the sound, he guided his mount around a bend in the creek and stopped in amazement at what he saw. In a hidden valley, green with grass fed by a natural spring, a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. But what caught his attention even more was the figure tending them, an Apache woman, perhaps 30 years of age, moving gracefully among the animals with the confidence of someone who belonged to this land as naturally as the wind and water. She had noticed him too. Rather than fleeing as he might have expected, she stood perfectly still, watching him with dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his appearance. Her long black hair was braided with colorful beads, and she wore a traditional Apache dress decorated with intricate patterns. There was no fear in her posture, only a calm wariness. Thomas dismounted slowly, his hands visible and empty, trying to communicate peaceful intentions. He had picked up a few words of Apache during his years in the territory, mostly from trading encounters, but his pronunciation was poor and his vocabulary limited. "Please," he said in English, then struggled with the Apache words he remembered. "Baby. Hungry. Need milk." The woman tilted her head, studying him with intelligent eyes. She spoke in Apache, her voice melodious but firm, gesturing toward his empty pail. Thomas pointed to himself, then made the universal gesture of holding a baby, his face contorted with the anguish of a desperate father. Understanding seemed to dawn on the woman's face. She had seen enough of life to recognize the desperation of a parent fighting for their child's survival. Her expression softened slightly, though she remained cautious. She spoke again in Apache, then surprised him by switching to heavily accented but clear English. "Your child dies without milk," she said simply. Thomas nodded vigorously, relief flooding through him at finding someone who could understand his plight. "Yes, my son. 4 days old. My wife cannot feed him. Please, if you have milk to spare, I can pay you. I have money, horses, cattle." The woman was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving from Thomas to his worn appearance, to the desperate hope in his eyes. She seemed to be weighing something in her mind. making a decision that would carry consequences neither of them could fully foresee. "I am Ayana," she said finally. "These are my cattle. My husband died in the winter sickness. I care for them alone now." Thomas felt his heart sink. A widow protecting her livelihood would be unlikely to part with precious milk. But Ayana continued speaking. "I know the pain of losing children," she said quietly. "The sickness took my 2 sons. I would not wish this pain on any parent." She walked to one of the cows, a gentle-looking animal with a swollen udder, and Thomas realized she was considering his request. Hope surged through him again as he watched her examine the animal with practiced hands. "This cow gives more milk than I need," Ayana said. "But the journey to your ranch, it is dangerous for me. Your people do not trust mine." Thomas understood her concern immediately. An Apache woman traveling with a white rancher would face suspicion and possibly violence from both sides. The peace between their peoples was fragile, built more on exhaustion from years of conflict than any real understanding or trust. "I'll protect you," Thomas said earnestly. "My wife and I are not like those who hate your people. We came here to build a life, not to make war." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, and Thomas had the feeling she was reading something in his character, searching for deception or hidden malice. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "I will come," she said, "but not to your ranch. There is an old line shack near Willow Creek. You know this place?" Thomas nodded. The abandoned cabin was about 2 hours' ride from his ranch, far enough to avoid immediate detection but close enough for him to make regular trips. "I will bring the cow there," Ayana continued. "You can take milk to your child. If your people discover me, you will say you found the cow wandering and claimed it as salvage." It was a generous offer and a clever solution. Thomas felt overwhelming gratitude toward this woman who was willing to risk her safety to help save his son's life. But even as hope filled his heart, he wondered what consequences this arrangement might bring for both of them. As Ayana began gathering her few possessions and preparing the milk cow for the journey, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was changing his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. The desperate search for milk had brought him into contact with someone whose knowledge and kindness might prove to be exactly what his struggling family needed. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as they prepared to leave the hidden valley. Thomas mounted his horse while Ayana expertly led the milk cow by a woven halter. As they made their way toward Willow Creek, both of them were acutely aware that they were crossing invisible boundaries that divided their worlds. Neither spoke much during the journey, but there was no hostility between them. Instead, there was the shared understanding of 2 people who had experienced loss and were now working together to prevent another tragedy. For Thomas, Ayana represented hope for his son's survival. For Ayana, helping this desperate father was perhaps a way to honor the memory of her own lost children. When they finally reached the old line shack as the last light of day painted the sky in brilliant orange and purple, both knew that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. The simple act of sharing milk had brought together 2 people from different worlds, united by the universal bond of caring for the young and vulnerable. The old line shack stood weathered and forgotten in the grove of willow trees that gave Willow Creek its name. Thomas had built this shelter years ago when he first started ranching, back when he needed temporary housing while moving cattle between pastures. Now its rough wooden walls and tin roof would serve a purpose he never could have imagined. Ayana examined the small structure with the practical eye of someone accustomed to making the best of simple accommodations. The single room was dusty but dry, with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a narrow window that looked out toward the creek. It would serve their purpose well enough. "This will work," she said, tying the milk cow to a sturdy post outside. "The cow will have water from the creek and grass to eat. I can milk her twice each day." Thomas watched as Ayana expertly milked the gentle animal, filling his pail with rich, creamy liquid that seemed like liquid gold to his desperate eyes. The cow stood patiently, clearly accustomed to Ayana's gentle but efficient hands. "How long can you stay?" Thomas asked, already dreading the answer. He knew this arrangement couldn't last forever, but his son would need milk for weeks or even months. "As long as needed," Ayana replied simply. "My cattle are safe in the hidden valley. They know the way to water and good grass. They will survive without me for a time." Thomas felt overwhelming relief wash through him. With shaking hands, he accepted the full pail of milk, knowing that this precious liquid would save his son's life. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. his voice rough with emotion. Ayanna looked at him with understanding eyes. "Save your child," she said. "That is thanks enough." The ride back to his ranch had never seemed so long, though Thomas pushed his horse harder than usual, eager to get the life-saving milk to his weakening son. When he finally burst through the front door of his house, Sarah was sitting in their bedroom, holding baby William and singing a soft lullaby, tears streaming down her pale face. "Sarah!" Thomas called out, his voice filled with hope for the first time in days. "I found milk." Sarah looked up, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. When she saw the pail full of fresh milk in Thomas's hands, she burst into tears of relief and joy. Working together, they fashioned a feeding device from a clean cloth and a small spoon, carefully dripping the precious milk into their son's tiny mouth. At first, William seemed too weak to respond, but gradually his natural instincts took over, and he began to swallow eagerly. "Where did you find this?" Sarah asked, watching in amazement as their son began to show signs of renewed strength. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then decided that honesty was the only way forward. "An Apache woman helped me," he said carefully. "She has cattle hidden in a valley to the north. She's staying at the old line shack so I can get fresh milk twice a day." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise, but she didn't show the fear or anger that Thomas had worried about. Instead, she looked down at their son, who was feeding with increasing vigor, and her expression was one of pure gratitude. "Then I owe this woman my son's life," she said quietly. "What is her name?" "Ayanna," Thomas replied. "She lost her own children to sickness. I think that's why she was willing to help us." Over the following days, Thomas established a routine. Each morning and evening, he would ride to Willow Creek, where Ayanna would have fresh milk waiting for him. She had cleaned up the old line shack and made it surprisingly comfortable, using her knowledge of desert living to create a functional, temporary home. During these visits, Thomas and Ayanna began to talk more freely. Despite the language barrier and cultural differences, they found common ground in their shared experiences as people trying to survive and thrive in the harsh frontier environment. Ayanna shared stories of her childhood, growing up in a world where her people moved freely across the land, following the seasons and the animals that sustained them. "My father taught me to read the signs," she told Thomas one evening as he prepared to head home with the day's milk. "The way clouds gather, how animals behave before storms, where to find water in the dry season. This knowledge kept our people alive for countless generations." Thomas found himself fascinated by her wisdom about the land he was still learning to understand. In return, he shared stories about his own journey to the territory, the challenges of building a ranch from nothing, and his dreams of creating a lasting home for his family. Baby William grew stronger each day, his cries becoming more vigorous and his movements more active. Sarah began to regain her strength as well. No longer consumed with worry about their son's survival, she started asking more questions about the woman who was saving their child's life. "What is she like?" Sarah asked one evening as Thomas returned with the evening milk. "She's remarkable," Thomas said, struggling to find the right words. "She knows more about surviving in this land than most men I've met. She's kind, but there's a strength in her that comes from facing real hardship. She could have refused to help us, or demanded payment we couldn't afford. Instead, she's risking her own safety to save our son." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching William feed contentedly. "I would like to meet her," she said finally, "to thank her properly." Thomas considered this carefully. He knew that bringing Sarah to the line shack would be risky, but he also understood his wife's desire to express her gratitude personally. "When you're stronger," he said, "and when we can be sure it's safe." As the days passed, Thomas noticed changes in himself as well. His conversations with Ayanna were opening his mind to different ways of understanding the world around him. She showed him which plants could be used for medicine, how to read weather patterns more accurately, and where to find the best grass for cattle during different seasons. One morning, as he arrived at the line shack, he found Ayanna tending to a small garden she had started near the cabin. She was growing traditional Apache plants, corn, beans, and squash, using seeds she had carried with her. "The three sisters," she explained when she saw his curious look. "They grow together, help each other. The corn gives the beans something to climb, the beans give strength to the soil, and the squash keeps the weeds away and holds water in the earth." Thomas was amazed by the simple wisdom of this agricultural practice. On his own ranch, He had struggled with poor soil and unpredictable water supplies. "Could you teach me about this?" he asked. Ayanna smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since they met. "Knowledge shared grows stronger," she said. "Like the three sisters, people who help each other create something better than what they could make alone." This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. What had begun as a desperate emergency arrangement was evolving into something deeper, a mutual respect and friendship that transcended the racial and cultural boundaries that divided their peoples. However, Thomas was also becoming increasingly aware of the risks their arrangement posed. Several times, he had noticed riders in the distance, and he worried that someone might discover Ayanna's presence at the line shack. The peace between whites and Apaches was fragile, maintained more by mutual exhaustion than any real trust. If the wrong people discovered that he was harboring an Apache woman, it could mean danger for his entire family. One evening, as he prepared to leave with the day's milk, Ayanna surprised him with an unexpected question. "Your wife," she said. "She grows stronger now. Soon she will not need my help." What then? Thomas realized that he had been so focused on the day-to-day routine of saving his son that he hadn't fully considered what would happen when William was old enough to eat other foods. The question forced him to confront the reality that their arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose you'll want to return to your cattle, your own life." Ayanna nodded slowly, but Thomas detected something in her expression that suggested the matter wasn't entirely simple for her either. "Yes," she said, "that would be the wise thing to do." But as Thomas rode home that evening, he found himself hoping that wisdom wouldn't be the only consideration when the time came for Ayanna to leave. Over the past weeks, she had become more than just the woman who was saving his son's life. She had become a friend, a teacher, and someone whose presence had enriched his family's life in unexpected ways. The bond between them was growing stronger each day. But so were the dangers that surrounded their unlikely friendship. Thomas knew that soon they would have to make decisions about the future that could change everything for both their families. 6 weeks had passed since that desperate first meeting at the Hidden Valley, and baby William had transformed from a weak, failing infant into a healthy, robust child whose hearty cries now filled the Mitchell ranch house with the sounds of life and hope. Sarah had regained her strength and was now able to produce milk of her own, supplementing what Ayanna provided and gradually preparing for the day when they would no longer need the Apache woman's help. But as that day approached, both Thomas and Sarah found themselves reluctant to see Ayanna disappear from their lives. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had grown into something much more meaningful. Ayanna had become part of their daily routine, their extended family, and the thought of losing her felt like a tragedy waiting to happen. The morning when everything changed started like any other. Thomas rode to Willow Creek to collect the day's milk, expecting to find Ayanna waiting with her usual calm efficiency. Instead, he found her standing beside her packed belongings, the milk cow already prepared for travel. "Today I return to my valley," she announced without preamble. "Your son no longer needs my milk to survive. My work here is finished." Thomas felt a stab of loss that surprised him with its intensity. Over the weeks, these daily meetings had become the highlight of his day. Ayanna's wisdom, her knowledge of the land, and her quiet strength had enriched his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Wait," he said quickly, "before you go. Would you come to our house? Just once? Sarah has been asking to meet you for weeks. She wants to thank you properly for saving our son." Ayanna hesitated, clearly torn between her desire to avoid potential danger and her own curiosity about the woman whose child she had helped save. "It is risky," she said finally. "If your neighbors see me." "They won't," Thomas assured her. "The nearest ranch is 10 miles away, and Sarah and we're not like the others who fear your people. We see you for who you are, the woman who saved our son's life." After a long moment, Ayanna nodded slowly. "I will come," she said, but only briefly. The ride to the Mitchell ranch was tense for both of them. Ayanna had not been this close to a white settlement since her husband's death, and Thomas was acutely aware of the risks he was asking her to take. But when they finally arrived at the small ranch house, and Sarah appeared in the doorway holding baby William, the moment felt right. Sarah had prepared for this meeting with great care. She had cleaned the house thoroughly, prepared her best meal, and dressed William in his finest clothes. When she saw Ayanna dismounting from her horse, grace and dignity evident in every movement. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude so powerful, it brought tears to her eyes. "You must be Ayanna," Sarah said, stepping forward with William in her arms. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is William, the son whose life you saved." Ayanna looked at the healthy, robust baby and smiled softly. "He is strong now," she said. "He will grow to be a good man." "Thanks to you," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, come inside. I've prepared food. It's the least we can do after everything you've done for our family." The meal that followed was unlike anything any of them had experienced before. Sarah had prepared her best dishes, while Ayanna shared traditional Apache foods she had brought as gifts. Pine nut cakes, dried meat, seasoned with wild herbs, and a tea made from desert plants that had both medicinal and nutritional properties. As they ate, the conversation flowed more naturally than Thomas had expected. Sarah's genuine warmth and gratitude melted through Ayanna's natural caution, and soon they were talking like old friends. Sarah asked about Apache customs, while Ayanna inquired about Sarah's life before coming to the territory. "I was a teacher back in Missouri," Sarah explained. "I had always dreamed of helping children learn to read and write. When Thomas and I came west, I thought I would have to give up that dream." "Knowledge is precious," Ayanna responded thoughtfully. "In my tribe, the old women teach the young ones the stories and traditions that keep our people strong. Perhaps here too, there are children who need teaching." It was then that Sarah had an idea that would change all their lives. "Ayanna," she said carefully, what if you didn't have to leave? What if there was a way for you to stay here, with us?" Thomas looked at his wife in surprise, while Ayanna raised her eyebrows questioningly. "I've been thinking," Sarah continued, speaking faster now as the idea took shape. "There are other ranching families scattered across this territory. Children growing up without schools, without anyone to teach them. You have so much knowledge about this land, about medicine, about survival. And I have knowledge about reading and writing. Together, we could start a school." Ayanna was silent for a long moment, considering this unexpected proposal. "Your people would not accept learning from an Apache woman," she said finally. "Some wouldn't," Thomas admitted, "but others would. The Johnsons have 3 children and live 20 miles from the nearest town. The Hartmans have been trying to teach their kids themselves but don't have the skills. There are families out here who care more about their children's education than about old prejudices." Sarah reached across the table and gently took Ayanna's hand. "You saved my son's life," she said. "You've shared your wisdom about this land with my husband. You've shown us kindness when you had every reason to be suspicious of us. If there are people who can't see past the color of your skin to recognize your worth, then that's their loss." Ayanna looked down at their joined hands, then at baby William, who was sleeping peacefully in his mother's lap. "My cattle," she said quietly, "could be moved to our land," Thomas suggested eagerly. "We have plenty of grazing area, and they'd be safer here than hidden in the valley. You could have your own cabin, your independence, but still be part of our family." "It would be dangerous," Ayanna warned. "There are those among both our peoples who would not understand." "There's danger in everything worth doing," Sarah replied firmly. "But there's also hope. Hope for children who need education. Hope for families who need your knowledge of medicine and the land. And hope for our peoples to learn that we have more in common than what divides us." Over the next hour, they discussed the practical details of such an arrangement. Thomas offered to build Ayanna her own cabin on his land, close enough for cooperation but far enough away to provide privacy and independence. Sarah outlined her vision for a small school that could serve the scattered ranching families of the region. Ayanna shared her concerns about potential backlash from both white settlers and her own people. Finally, Ayanna stood and walked to the window, looking out across the land that had become familiar to her over the past weeks. When she turned back to face Thomas and Sarah, there was resolve in her dark eyes. "I will try," she said simply, "for the children who need learning, for the families who need healing knowledge, and for the memory of my own sons, who did not live to see such possibilities." The decision made, they began planning immediately. Thomas would start construction on a small cabin the next week, positioned near a grove of cottonwood trees that would provide shade and privacy. Sarah would begin reaching out to neighboring families to gauge their interest in a school. Ayanna would move her cattle to Thomas's land and begin preparing lesson plans that would combine traditional Apache knowledge with practical frontier skills. The first families to respond to Sarah's inquiries were, as Thomas had predicted, those most desperate for educational opportunities for their children. The Hartman family, living in an isolated valley 30 miles away, jumped at the chance to have their children properly educated. Mrs. Johnson, a widow struggling to manage her ranch while raising 4 children alone, saw the school as an answer to her prayers. When Ayana's new cabin was completed 3 weeks later, it marked the beginning of an experiment that would reshape the entire community. The small log structure was beautiful in its simplicity, with large windows that let in plenty of light, and a covered porch where Ayana could work on traditional crafts while enjoying the view of the surrounding mountains. The first day of school arrived with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. 7 children from 4 different families gathered in the main room of Sarah's house, which had been converted into a classroom. Ayana had prepared carefully, choosing lessons that would blend traditional education with practical frontier knowledge. She began by teaching the children about the plants and animals of the region, showing them which berries were safe to eat, which leaves could be used to treat cuts and bruises, and how to read the signs that predicted weather changes. Sarah followed up by helping the children write down what they had learned, turning Ayana's oral teachings into written knowledge they could reference later. The children were fascinated by Ayana's stories and grateful for her practical knowledge. 8-year-old Emma Hartman was particularly eager to learn about medicinal plants, having watched her mother struggle with illnesses that doctors couldn't treat. 10-year-old Billy Johnson was fascinated by Ayana's knowledge of animal tracking and hunting techniques. As weeks turned into months, word of the unique school spread throughout the territory. Some families traveled long distances to enroll their children, while others remained skeptical or hostile to the idea of Apache-influenced education. But those who overcame their prejudices found that their children were receiving an education that was both broader and more practical than anything available in the distant towns. Ayana's presence began to change the Mitchell family in profound ways as well. She taught Thomas new techniques for managing his cattle that improved his herd's health and productivity. She showed Sarah how to prepare traditional foods that were more nutritious and better suited to the desert climate. Most importantly, she became like a grandmother to young William, sharing stories and traditions that connected him to the deeper history of the land where he was growing up. The arrangement wasn't without challenges. There were occasional threats from settlers who disapproved of the school, and Ayana sometimes faced suspicion from other Apache people who questioned her choice to live among whites. But the benefits far outweighed the difficulties. One evening, as they sat on Ayana's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors, Thomas reflected on how much their lives had changed since that desperate day when he had searched for milk to save his son. "I came looking for milk," he said quietly, "and found family." Ayana smiled, bouncing baby William on her knee while Sarah prepared lesson plans for the next day. "Sometimes," she replied, "what we need finds us when we open our hearts to possibilities we never imagined." Sarah looked up from her work and added, "Our children will grow up in a world where differences are celebrated rather than feared. That's the greatest gift we can give them." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the 3 adults and baby William represented something new in the territory. A family bound not by blood or tradition, but by kindness, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to creating a better future for the next generation. The desperate search for milk had indeed saved baby William's life, but it had also created something even more precious. A bridge between 2 worlds, and proof that understanding and cooperation could overcome even the deepest divisions.